Hey, Adam.
Hey, Beth.
Hey, you ready for part two on managing change?
Can't be more excited.
It's the most fun. I think even with this one, we're still going to just be scratching the surface. There's so
Sure.
much. Well, we might have to make this like a revisit this again in the future.
Yeah.
Uh, so the last session, we had you talk through business transformation. And this one, I want to talk a little bit about technology transformation. So
Sure.
we talked about a technical company, but they were thinking about how they needed to pivot their business. I
Yeah.
want to look a little bit more at when you're implementing some kind of enterprise software that's theoretically going to have a major impact on your organization and affect a lot of stakeholders. How do you think about driving that adoption to ensure that's getting used? So
Cool.
that's the context that I looked at. And
Nice.
even with that, still just kind of the tip of the iceberg on how you think about it. So let me share my screen and we'll jump in. Okay.
Got it.
So, I mean, I would preface by saying, you need to get the right people in the room for your discovery and planning. And that's going to be both technical stakeholders who understand the system that's being configured and deployed, as well as those business stakeholders who understand the teams being impacted. And on the business side, you're going to want a mix of both leadership as well as individual contributors. So those high performers on the team that you're going to get involved in the implementation and the deployment want to be in the discussion. There's, like you, when you talked about why do we need to change, there's a huge literature on theory as well as practical advice on managing change.
I
And,
bet.
we're not going to get into all of it, but one of the things that I like to start on with is kind of the stakeholder discovery, which is really critical for defining what you need to do. And so with technical transformation projects, change management is often given short shrift, not because people don't care about it, but because so much time and effort goes into the technology implementation itself. It's a bit of an afterthought. It's the, launch and run Molotov cocktail deployment strategy that you see on a regular basis with a lot of tech implementations. So most people have gone through at least one major tech project in their career, either running it or being receiving it. And so they've all have some experience. So like you, I wanted to start with that. Why is this important? But I wanted to make it very personal and kind of ask that question around, have you gone through this before? And if so, how did it go? And so you can do a little, raise your hand of anyone
Sure.
who's had like a perfect project go really well for a tech implementation. You don't get a lot of hands, but I like to get a little bit deeper than that. So I did it as a quick poll to see where are people landing? Have they seen really great technology deployments? Have they seen really bad ones? Are they somewhere in the middle? And in this case, you see a bit of a spread, but a big thing that comes up as a recurring theme is that, okay, yes, they got the technology launched, but over time, they didn't see the kind of adoption that they were expecting. And so that's really helpful to understand that as the context when you're moving into the next project. And so what I took it to after that was, okay, what went wrong then, right? So if you had things not be perfect, which is
Yeah.
common, what was it that caused it to go awry? And so for this brainstorm, I typically don't show the results initially. I want people to think through their own experiences and submit as many ideas as they want
Yeah.
beforehand before I'll share it. And so when then you do get it, you'll see a lot of content, you'll
Oh, wow.
see a
Yeah.
lot overlapping themes. And that's part of the point, is to help to identify what are those core themes that result in issues so that we can turn those into focus areas for planning. So for example, you see up at the top, there's, a couple that are around technology. It didn't meet the needs of the business. So maybe that was a selection issue, or, this one was, we implemented the same process as a new tool, but we really needed was a new process. So something around, we should have thought more broadly about the way we were doing it. So after you collect all this, you can debrief it by going through and talking about them. And then you can also start to group them. So you can see, okay, there's a couple things with technology. And so
Yeah.
I did next where I grouped them all, and you end up with some pretty core themes, right? There's a
Nice.
lot to unpack in prepping for a successful deployment. And so, obviously technology is a huge one, and that's where a lot of people spend time on, what are we trying to use it for? What do we need it to do? What are the features need to look like? Are we configuring it in the right way? And so there's a fair amount that gets done technically, but there's also a fair amount that gets done in terms of how are people going to be expected to use it. Process is another area. We talked about that a little bit before with someone saying, okay, you just implemented the old process in a new tool, but what we really needed was to kind of update the way we're doing
New
things.
process, yeah.
Stakeholders is, where I really live is, I think it's the linchpin for really driving adoption and managing change in a technology perspective. Technology is pretty predictable, but people are not. And at the end of the day, the technology is only successful if people are using it. So the other thing is when you unpack what stakeholders need and where they're at, it's going to really inform the next three, which are around the logistics of how you deploy a solution and manage change, which is really communication, training, and support are the big three. There's other things that you can put in place as well in terms of governance and so on.
Sure.
But these things can only be defined if you really understand your stakeholders and where they're at. So that's what, let me pause there and see what you think about that.
Well, I love the clustering and, taking the sort of, dense information and scattering it down, and certainly help to to debrief all of that. I was curious on the stakeholder piece. Maybe that's where you said you have a lot of energy and attention around. I guess I'm just curious where we go from there, because it feels like this is important, but my brain says all of these are important from an implementation perspective.
You're not wrong. Your brain is on fire today. So they're all very important. But again, I start with stakeholders because all of the things you're going to do is going to impact them. So you need to understand what you need to do with and for them to be successful. And so the rest of the session really dug into that due diligence around, well, what does that mean? Who are the stakeholders, and what do we need to know about them to prepare for this? So the next thing I took it to was this notion of who are the stakeholders. And when I run this as a brainstorming, you can come in with this preceded if you've done some prior calls, one-on-one discovery, and then open it up for who else. Is there anyone else that's missing? But if you're doing it in real time, I'll start with this actually open, so the results showing when you're in the brainstorm, because there's only so many groups in the organization, and so that'll avoid some of that duplication and the need to group things again. There could be a lot more stakeholders than this. There could be, like legal and finance and so on. The main thing when you think about stakeholders is how granular do you need to get, right? Do you keep it as high level of, oh, we're doing a CRM implementation, so we need to have sales and we need to have marketing? Or do you start breaking it down to inside sales versus field sales versus account management and so on? And for that, it really comes down to how will they be using the technology? And if it's largely in the same way, then you can keep them grouped. But if they're going to be doing different things to meet the specific needs of their function, then you're going to want to think about them as different stakeholder groups, because you're going to need to train them differently. And you may have different communications that you're going to send to them based on the kinds of things that they need to do and the things that they'll care about. So that's how I think about identifying those stakeholder groups.
Makes sense.
From there, that's when you need to start really digging in. And this is where a lot of the time ends up sitting, is for each of those audiences, you really want to start by identifying where are they at now, right? This is the as-is state. How some are just logistical, how many people, where are they located, are they distributed, what do they do, what's their role in the organization? Companies won't always have really clear names. They'll have specific names for teams that don't necessarily mean something to an outside person. So what are they doing? And then digging in really to what's the value of this initiative to them, right? If they're being asked to take on a new CRM, there's got to be a reason that is important to them, that makes it worthwhile. And also trying to do some discovery around, well, what are the potential concerns that could derail or make it harder for them to adopt the technology? And so this is where you're going to want to have those business stakeholders in the room, people who understand the different groups, either from a leadership level or from being within, and having both perspectives is helpful because they're going to know different things. And then finally, as you're understanding the potential concerns and the value, how can you get ahead of them and start to mitigate some of the things that might take you offline? So you're going to want to understand not just around the initiative itself, but anything else. So for example, in this one, in this team, in the account management, their leader recently left and has been replaced. So that's going to be another piece of information you're going to want to factor as you're doing communications, especially because they don't have a strong person who's driving it from the top down at all. So how are you going to mitigate that? Is there someone else who can step in and speak to, hey, this is really important. This is what we're going to be doing and why it matters to us.
Sure. So Beth, so you've gotten like a pre-mortem as to why these things have not gone well. You have an hypothesis that stakeholders are a big part of that, or at least your data actually supported that. You had a lot of data points. And so now this is like a little bit of a pre-planning, almost like a mitigation plan against, okay, we know stakeholders are important. Technology doesn't get implemented by robots all the time. It has to deal with people as well. So let's think about those individuals. Let's have some empathy for where they're at. Let's think about some of their concerns on a business unit perspective. I like it. Okay.
Absolutely.
Where do we go from here?
Well, if you know where they are, where do you think the next thing is you're going to want to know?
You tell me. I mean, I guess we got to put together
Maybe
some.
the other end of the spectrum.
We got to go through.
Where do they need to be?
Yeah, we
So,
got to go through some actioning on some of this stuff, right?
So I want to know where they need to be, and actually, let's
okay,
talk
sure.
Of this. So I usually frame this as a hypothetical. Like, let's imagine a year from now, this was the most successful project we've ever done as an organization. We've hit it out of the park. What did that look like? And what I want to get is very specifically into the behaviors that need to change. So when we talked on the last conversation about the business transformation, you talked about mindsets.
Interesting, yeah.
Mindsets need to shift. And I was getting more into the pragmatic, like what behaviors need to shift. I think they're very connected.
Sure.
And so I opened this up to a pretty simple start, stop, continue exercise.
Sure.
Because you are going to ask people to do things differently. There's things that they're used to doing that they need to stop that are potentially just as important as what you're going to train them on and what they need to start doing or continue to do. And so, for example, if your sales directors are asking the team to provide updates outside of your CRM system, if they're usually asking for forecasts and spreadsheets, then that's not going to lead to the salespeople themselves entering data on a consistent basis in CRM. So really getting into the individual group level, what behaviors need to change and adapt, and thinking about how they impact each other as well. So that's as deep as I got for now, but you can imagine how all of this information would inform the communication plan, the training plan, the support plan, what needs to be built out based on your understanding now of the people involved, where they're at and where they need to get to. So it's that, like, fill that gap to create that path to success.
Love it. This is potentially volatile data, right? Because it's like, these are shifts that people need to make or things they need to stop doing. My guess is you need to get consensus at best, buy-in, would be better from each of these different leaders. So having, whoever the champion is that people look up to, or the leader, if that person's the same person, great. For each of these different groups, weigh in on some of this, would also be, I think, a pretty effective means to getting some of this moving forward. But having all this laid out this way is great.
Yeah, you hit on something really important there. And so it's part of why you want so many people in the room agreeing on the need and the plan. And it's a big reason why you do spend time not just on who are they, but what's the value to them.
Yeah, sure.
Because the change in behaviors, if you're asking, the more change you're asking of people, the more support you need to provide them to make it. And it comes with, why are we even doing this? What's the impact, not just to you or to your group, but to the organization as a whole, and being able to articulate that. This concept of, it could be volatile, and how do you really start to set the stage to shift those behaviors effectively does go into a lot of the way you structure your rollout. So, one of the things I like to suggest is you need to take maybe 5% of the amount of people in the group and make them early adopters, right?
Sure.
Focus really early and significantly on making them super effective in the new system and really articulate around those value props at that level, because that peer-to-peer support is super powerful in helping people understand what they need to do and how they need to do it, and to get to that shift.
Yeah. And Beth, where do you see this session fitting into like the before, during, after side of tech transformation, just to put it simple.
Yeah, that's perfect. I would want it to be kind of in between before and during. So after a technology has been selected and after kind of business analysts have dug their diligence around what the processes are that are going to be configured into the system, so they understand what it is people need to do.
Yeah.
Before you start training and turn it live, you need to do some of this upfront discovery and planning, and then build out the communication, training, and support, because the communication needs to happen before launch. Training needs to happen a little bit before and after, and then support needs to happen kind of ongoing. And it's not just, hey, you can have someone available on day one. You need to
Yeah.
have for as new people get onboarded into the organization 3 months out, how do they get brought up to speed and trained and so on? And as people are using the tool and realizing there's changes that they need to make it really effective for their team, how do they submit those? So having those feedback loops, having those pre-thought out and predefined avenues for people to not just hear about what's happening, but be heard about what's happening and how to make it more effective.
Yeah. I just, as you were going through that, I was wondering about the evaluation selection side. Like, would you ever do this prior to that to determine the change? I don't know, like the weight of the change, or how much of a shift this is going to have, and then potentially certain vendors, if you bought from them versus others, they would have less impact because some of this maybe potential concerns or stuff are different depending on. I don't know if how this plays into that, or have you seen it?
That's a good question. I think it's going to be less about the vendor having a smaller impact and more about the level of change you're introducing with
Sure.
the technology, either as a part of it or in conjunction with it. So, if you're having to change the culture significantly, so maybe you have a sales culture where people are not used to sharing information about their prospects,
Yeah.
right? Or you have a culture where people sandbag and they don't put their opportunities into any kind of system until a proposal's been sent out. That's a much bigger shift to the concept of a 360 review of a customer and a CRM is supposed to enable.
Yeah.
And so it won't matter what CRM system you're choosing there, but it will matter that that's a big cultural shift that you're going to have to do a lot more with beyond just technical training.
Got it. Super helpful. Well, you've made me realize how complicated and important all of this is from a technology transformation perspective. It's not as easy as, downloading some new software and then telling myself, figure it out, get on YouTube. There's a lot going on, especially in the size of that you're talking about.
I mean, if it's one person learning a new tool and having
Yeah.
fun, sure, you don't need to do all this. But again, the larger the group, the more you want to put some thought into it. And the bigger the change, the more you want to put some effort into it. And then finally, it's not hard to define a change program, right? Communication isn't an unknown thing. Training is not an unknown thing. Support is not we know what the tools are to use. It's just they're typically underutilized for the level of effort that might actually be needed.
Cool. Well, thanks, Beth.
Yeah,
That was a nice follow-up to my one. Design challenge number 3 on change, business transformation, technical transformation. Thank you.
Love it. Talk later.